just before we kick off, the context behind this is that we are currently working on guidelines for rewilding. And yes, there is a huge focus on Europe often, but of course it's relevant across the world. And so we've got 3 presenters today who are going to give us a view from the other side, let's say, which has actually got some really useful nuances to consider when we talk about rewilding. So I'm not going to say too much more, and I'm going to pass over to Sally Hawkins. If she
Thanks,
can still
Jess.
hear us.
Hi, everyone. My name's Sally Hawkins. I'm a core member of the IUCN CEM Rewilding Thematic Group, and as others mentioned, we're currently developing global guidelines for rewilding. So I'm here to share some challenges we've faced in balancing the need for context-specific rewilding practices with creating adaptable international guidelines. Before I start, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where I live and work in Melbourne, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and also those of the lands where I'm currently on holiday and presenting from, the Bundjalung Nation, and extend my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I also acknowledge the invaluable ecological knowledge and custodianship of First Nations people, which inform conservation and rewilding practices globally. Next, please. Before I started my PhD, I worked as an Agile project manager in academic publishing. Any of you who've experienced with Agile will recognize the iterative cycle, which encourages interdisciplinary adaptive management. When I moved into working in environmental policy, I worked on a large-scale project to encourage collaborative catchment management. I found the iterative cycle suited these multi-stakeholder interdisciplinary projects really well. Projects weren't linear. They didn't have a fixed end goal, but adapted around changing resources and emerging stakeholder priorities. Next, please. Fundamental to the success of these kinds of projects are to co-develop. This can help to unite, even though there may be disagreement over priorities. Next, please. And this vision is supported by a robust problem framing process to create a shared understanding among stakeholders or partners of what we're trying to address. Next. This aligns with the theory of change framework, which I later discovered and used to frame my findings of my PhD around the why, what, and how rewilding. On the far left of the screen, you have the context setting or problem framing, essentially looking at the needs that you're trying to address and the root causes of those problems. Based on this, you shape the impact, the outcomes, and vision you're trying to achieve, and then create your approach around this knowledge, overall creating a roadmap to get from the present context to the desired future. Next, please. So what is problem framing? In problem framing, you consider the issues you're trying to address, how they're defined and conceptualized. How you frame a problem influences the solutions considered and actions taken, and that's why it's so important. Using Maslow's hammer analogy, if all you have is a hammer, all your problems look like nails. Similarly, if all you have are social scientists, all your problems will look like people problems. Or conversely, if all your problems look like nails, all you need is a hammer. A robust problem framing process helps to mitigate the risks that come with overly simplistic problem and solution framings. Next, please. And we are all becoming very well aware that complex problems require the whole toolbox, systems thinking and interdisciplinary collaboration. This aligns with recommendations from the IPBES to integrate different types of evidence and knowledge in problem framing, address direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss, use the right combination of tools to suit the scale and context. As policymakers and practitioners, we're not only trying to create change to values and systems outwardly in the world, but we need transformative change in our own methods and institutions. Problem framing helps to integrate this transformative change in our own work. Next, please. So let's look at problem framing and some of the challenges using rewilding as a case study. And here I'll be referring to my PhD thesis. Next, please. This draws on a survey of those involved in shaping rewilding theory and practice, particularly looking at pioneers of the field of rewilding. So there is a bias towards North America and Western Europe. And I also drew from texts that those people said were influential to their understanding of rewilding. Next, please. So what does problem framing look like in rewilding? Well, in terms of the theory of change, there's a tendency to focus on the areas in red, the observable issues that can be addressed directly through targeted interventions. Next, please. Rewilding is very context specific, meaning it's shaped around the local context. This is a good thing. It means that rewilding practice is place-based. But it does mean that the focus is largely on observable problems, and engaging with the root causes of those problems is limited. So, for example, in the problem column, you have isolated protected areas. This was a problem identified by those promoting rewilding in North America and in Europe. In both cases, they promote creating connectivity between protected areas or expanding protected areas. For the problem of missing species and their ecological functions, the solution is species reintroductions, etc., etc. So the tendency to focus on the local context and on ecological problems raises a couple of challenges when you're trying to create international rewilding policy that can be adapted to different contexts. Firstly, the interventions look very similar to interventions used in ecological restoration and conservation, and there remains uncertainty that rewilding is anything new. Rewilding is often equated with its interventions. So, for example, people associate rewilding with species reintroductions or with wilderness preservation. But this isn't true for all rewilding practice. And so these theories are often rejected by practitioners. Another issue is that when you try to take the context out of it and group these problems under a single theme to create policy, they're often seen collectively as human-caused problems, which essentially frames the problem as people versus nature. So the solutions lean towards binary thinking. We see this in many rewilding frameworks that set anthropogenic influence on a scale opposite to pristine wilderness. This has caused further problems when trying to create rewilding policy because it creates a paradox. How can you promote rewilding interventions by humans while at the same time promoting human withdrawal? Next, please. Next, please, Emma. Oh, there you go. Thanks. Oh, back one. If you take a step back from that and you consider root causes of these problems, you start to get a much fuller picture. And actually, rewilding theorists engaged with the root causes of ecological degradation from the very beginning. Next, please. So you can see that, yes, escalating human influence and ecological degradation are part of the problem, but these are considered together with colonialism and colonial hegemony. Actually, when the Wildlands Network was first introduced in 1992 in North America, they made a point to set themselves against colonial hegemony, capitalism in particular, overconsumption and commodification of natural resources. When Franz Vera introduced his wood pasture theory, which has been very influential on rewilding in Europe, he posed it as addressing problems associated with appropriated crown lands, causing wild, domestic, or human nature distinction. So we see these influencing problem framings in rewilding, along with other causes and effects that can be seen as a vicious cycle of dewilding. These include human nature disconnection, with concerns that people become physically, psychologically, and spiritually detached from the rest of nature, negatively impacting human well-being. And important to rewilding, creating these cultural values for control and order, a human need to control or subdue natural processes, increasing fear of wild nature, risk intolerance, etc., etc. Next, please. So in terms of framing a solution to this more complex problem, if dewilding is considered a vicious cycle, then rewilding seeks to counteract this by effecting a virtuous cycle, using a suite of interventions to address both issues and their root causes. Next, please. This expanded problem framing supports the creation of expanded vision for rewilding, identifying aims and outcomes, and offers a route to developing international rewilding guidelines that aren't based on context-specific issues, but can be adaptable to different contexts. Previous studies have focused on the ecological aim of achieving natural autonomy, but here we see there's intention for rewilding to promote landscape or systemic change and sociocultural change, with aims for resilient, sustainable, and wild landscapes, societal well-being, people accommodating wild nature in our landscapes. With this expanded problem framing and vision, we see that rewilding is interdisciplinary and transformative. Next, please. Focusing on the sociocultural aim of people accommodating wild nature in our landscapes, we've been able to develop a revised continuum for rewilding. It's not based on human and wilderness binaries. It demonstrates that there are degrees of accommodating nature, running from passive to active, and from active transitioning to embedded and self-sustaining. Instead of promoting the withdrawal of human influence from an area, this revised continuum focuses on the nature of that human influence. Also highlighted in this image is opposition to accommodating nature in landscapes. So barriers to rewilding are commonly related to policies, individuals, or values which promote unsustainable activities. Such barriers can be integrated into the scale as opposite to accommodating nature. Next, please. Also reflected with the grey arrow are suggested correlations between holistic perceptions of humans in nature or human-nature connection and coexistence. This reflects the potential that dualistic notions perpetuate human-nature disconnection and de-wilding, while holistic notions contribute to the sustainability and resilience of landscapes. Next, please. So to summarize, drawing the findings together into a rough theory of change for rewilding demonstrates the potential for the rewilding aims identified to act as a vision for a rewilded future. Here we see that rewilding is a response to the vicious cycle of de-wilding as a problem framing. Rewilding application is place-based, adaptive, and iterative, using different interventions to counteract de-wilding and affect a virtuous cycle of rewilding in pursuit of rewilding aims. Next, please. A framework aimed at practitioners, which lays out what this iterative process may look like in practice, is proposed here. This encourages projects to reflect on their intentions, assess the context, drawing on evidence from diverse stakeholders, and identifying barriers or opportunities for rewilding, identifying and prioritizing interventions based on those assessments and applying them. Next, please. So thank you very much. That's my slides done. I have covered a lot, so you can look up these references for more information. And also wanted to plug our Routledge Handbook of Rewilding, which is out in paperback now. I'm very pleased to introduce Robyn Bartel, who is also a lead editor of Rethinking Wilderness and the Wild, a former president of the Institute of Australian Geographers, and is currently Professor of Human Geography and Deputy Dean in the Faculty of Arts at Monash University in Melbourne.
Thank you so much, Sally, and thank you for the organisers of this event. I'm delighted to be joining you from Melbourne, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Kulin Nations here in Victoria in Australia, and acknowledge their elders past and present. I just want to start with a bit of a provocation actually related to our relationship with nature. I'm thinking about the idea of wilderness, and this is an Australian Heritage Commission brochure from the 1980s. I'm thinking about challenging some of the more dominant conceptions and conceptualizations of wilderness and the wild. I'm thinking about who is actually talking about wilderness and wild, and thinking about our relationship to nature. I hope you can hear the birds in the background, because that's how I'm relating to nature right currently. But thinking about how some of these conceptualizations are actually predicated and perpetuate a separation of human from nature that Sally was also just talking about, and that kind of binarizing viewpoint. And obviously, some of these ideas have changed over time. We've seen the idea of the wild as a kind of threat. Once we have a particular type of relationship with nature, then it positions the wilderness as the other. But it's still the other even when it's positioned as a romantic idealization of the sublime, and thinking about it as a counter to industrialization. So in both of these types of approaches, whether it's considered, as waste and undesirable, or whether it's considered as something that is worthy of protection, we've got this idea that it's basically a resourcist extractivist relationship. And I think some of these ideas, even when we think we have progressed, if you like, in the way we have been relating to non-human nature, still fundamentally embed this binarized and binarizing worldview. Even when we're looking at legislation and policy that is designed to be progressive, it perpetuates this idea of humans as different from, separate from, and that nature is better off if it's separated from the human. In Australia, we have some of our preserved areas preserved in this fashion, historically, dating back to the sort of celebrated national parks in North America, and with a similar type of separation that is embedded in the protectionist stance. I'm thinking about who it has actually excluded in the process. And a kind of quintessential idea of wilderness that is very, very dominant in Australia is the Tasmanian wilderness. And one of the sort of crucible environmentalist campaigns was to save the river from being dammed in Tasmania in the late 70s. And one of the chief arguments for the protection was natural heritage, this idea of pristine, untrammeled wilderness. And the next paragraph is actually quite offensive. So I just want to provide that warning, but it's actually embedded still in this idea that we have not only just separated, but completely excluded, and this violent exclusion. And paradoxically, however, one of the other arguments for protection was cultural heritage. The fact that, the interrelationship between human and nature goes back to millennia, that the nature that we were considered to be protecting from humans has actually been co-created by humans for a similar length of deep time. So I think we have a tension here that we cannot ignore and we cannot elide. And I think we perpetuate some of these violences and some of this exclusion by ignoring some of those tensions. And I don't know how many people use a Mac and had this as their background, just moving to the Northern Hemisphere and thinking about this sort of celebrated sort of ideal of pristine, human-free wilderness. And places like Yosemite were protected by the forced removal of the original and First Nations inhabitants. Similarly for Yellowstone. So this is a very confronting, I think, and concerning allusion if we just ignore some of these. This is not really history. This is actually present day exclusion. And we see it perpetuated even today in some of the conservationist arguments. Obviously, the giant in the field, E.O. Wilson, is talking about preserving half of the earth, protected against human intervention, and the only humans that would be allowed access to that preserved half would be scientists. So I think that this is part of the issue with using some of this terminology when it carries such significant baggage, but continues to perpetuate modern time violence. So what then for wilderness? And is there a different wilderness altogether that is conceptualized? Well, yes, it is. The wild country is actually uncared for country because humans have not been able to be present to manage it in a careful and considerate fashion. And similarly, in the United States, there is a very, similar sort of idea about uncared for country that is the wild. And perhaps we ourselves, in certain senses, may have become uncared for by losing those caring relationships with place. We do see some evolution in the terminology and the definitions that are being updated and need further updating, I would argue. I think some of the current definitions still, I do beg your pardon, I still need further revision to acknowledge these sorts of issues. And, oh, sorry, something's just been a little bit delayed, sorry, with the animation. I'm thinking about also how we see non-human nature and see ourselves as part of nature. And I think many of us will be familiar with this idea that, we want to go beyond that sort of anthropocentric, anthroparchic sort of view where the humans are somehow essentially different and exceptional, and replace us and decenter us as part of nature. And we have numerous strands in the literature that speaks to this kind of repositioning. And of course, a millennia of cultural practices, law and policy that have been developed and administered by First Nations peoples across the world, and particularly, of course, in Australia. So if we were to de-binarize and take away this sort of separation, how can we replace rewilding? Does it need to be replaced? And how can it be made something that is the more positive and productive conceptualization that we will need to affect environmental change, but also environmental and social justice? And I just wanted to reunite the Corvid with the human here. Ella went viral on TikTok a couple of years ago with her bird care work in Norwich. Just acknowledging my co-editors and co-authors in this edited collection, and thank everyone for listening, and thank you for the organisers again. I would like to now introduce our next speaker, Tristan. I just have to revert to my other laptop for the details. Tristan is a philosopher and ecologist researching the ethical problems thrown up by conservation and restoration practices, including the restoration of wilderness and autonomy in nature, the harming of animals for conservation outcomes, compassionate conservation, rewilding, animal wellbeing, and the reinstitution of Indigenous cultural practices. Tristan has published research papers on rewilding, biological invasions, animal refugees, and animal ethics. He's the course coordinator for the Diploma in Sustainable Living at the University of Tasmania, and the project manager of the Lungtalanana Cultural Restoration Project with the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre. Thank you, Tristan.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Robyn. That was a wonderful presentation, and thanks, Sally, as well. I don't have any slides. I'm just going to speak, and I'll keep it sort of brief and high level. But firstly, I'm presenting from Lutruwita, Tasmania. That's the traditional land of the Pakana people, and that land was never ceded. So I'd first like to pay my respects to this living country and to Pakana elders, past, present and emerging. This presentation is based on work I've been doing with Professor Freya Matthews from La Trobe University and Professor Chris Johnson from here at the University of Tasmania. So rewilding is a really broad church. It's open to diverse interpretations. And some people have seen this as a weakness, but I see it as a strength. I see it as adaptability that allows rewilding to be taken up in different contexts. But there are limits. The language, the assumptions and the practices of rewilding are often ill-suited to Indigenous communities, especially in colonised countries like Australia, like New Zealand, like Canada, like the USA. There are certain parallels in the experiences of Indigenous peoples in those places, but I'll mainly be talking about Indigenous communities here in Australia. I think that the problem of rewilding being ill-suited to these communities is important from both directions. It's important for those who see rewilding as an important mode of conservation, who hope that it can be applied on Aboriginal lands, but it's also important for Indigenous communities. They need all the tools they can get their hands on to pursue their aspirations for sovereignty and wealth and justice and healthy people and healthy country. So if rewilding obstructs or ignores these aspirations, it will, quite rightly, I think, be rejected. To understand this tension, it's important to define what I mean by rewilding here. There have been really great overviews of the history and meaning of rewilding. Tonight, I'll focus on its origins in North America during the 1990s. Rewilding then emphasised restoring large animals to vast protected ecosystems, which were identified as wilderness. The goal was to grant those animals the freedom to act as ecological agents, restoring and maintaining ecosystems at huge scales. There was a particular focus on large roaming predators like mountain lions and wolves and bears, and the cascading trophic effects that they could have on their ecosystems. Those predators were valued for their intrinsic worth, but also for their ecological work, because they could control herbivore populations and regenerate degraded landscapes. It's important to recognise, I think, that early rewilding was explicitly ecocentric, prioritised nature's intrinsic value rather than its utility, and kind of sided with John Muir rather than Gifford Pinchot in that old debate. Those themes of freedom, large animal agency, wilderness and ecocentrism, they were central to rewilding's identity then, and it made it inspiring for thousands of conservationists. It's obviously still inspiring people today, and it's growing. But my co-authors and I see some problems ahead. We see a looming clash between rewilding and some Indigenous communities, and we think that clash might be avoided. So to show you that problem, I'd like to look at conservation more broadly, just for a tick, and then come back and look at the history of rewilding, and then I'll introduce some case studies. I think it's becoming obvious to most conservationists that Indigenous communities are vital to global conservation. So they comprise less than 5% of the world's population, but they manage or have the rights to manage more than 25% of the planet's land, 40% of its protected areas, 40% of its ecologically intact landscapes. It's also important to recognise that those lands are not automatically available for conservation. In Australia, and I'm sure in other places, if we're going to meet our international obligations to restore and protect ecosystems, we need the consent, the participation and the leadership of Indigenous communities. Not just because of the moral right they have over their traditional lands, it's because also of the expertise that they have. Some of these peoples have been on their country for millennia, shaping their ecosystems in ways that are critical to maintaining biodiversity. But those Indigenous communities have very good reasons to be wary of conservationists, and Robyn spoke to that just now. Conservation has historically been entangled with colonisation, and iconic examples like the forced removals of Indigenous people to create national parks make Indigenous communities wary of conservation. And in more subtle ways, as Robyn ably demonstrated, the framing of nature as something to be protected from humans has erased those Indigenous histories of ownership and belonging and stewardship. It feels funny to say it, and Robyn just said it because, you know, as an academic in this field, this has been said for years and years and years, but we have to keep saying it because these ideas keep coming up. Now, rewilding, I think, has inherited these tensions for conservation. The early advocates of rewilding described wilderness as a place without people, but at the same time, that concept was being heavily critiqued for erasing Indigenous histories. You know, those critics correctly asked, if wilderness is defined by the absence of humans, what does that say about the people who lived there and still live there? So I don't want to go over that academic debate again, but I want to make the point that while some of conservation has engaged with those issues and begun the process of decolonisation, I think rewilding has lagged behind. In the early days, advocates like David Foreman doubled down on the wilderness ideal and dismissed Indigenous influences on the landscape as pretty much insubstantial. Just assumed that the smaller populations and simpler technologies were preventing them from doing harm that they were otherwise bound to do. And contemporary rewilding hasn't entirely escaped that legacy. We still talk about this idea of a monolithic humankind, all equally responsible for the ecological crisis. That's reinforced in rewilding discourse today, with its fascination for human-driven megafaunal extinctions and its mobilisation of Anthropocene narratives. And even today, Indigenous perspectives remain peripheral in rewilding discourse. The recent guidelines for rewilding that were put out by authors here, they're a big step forward. It's a great document and it's a great achievement for the Rewilding Thematic Group. But even in that document, Indigenous knowledge is made out to be an optional resource. So perhaps it's not surprising that Indigenous communities have largely ignored rewilding, and some of them are suspicious of it. There is the newly formed Indigenous Rewilding Network run out of the Flower Hill Institute based in the USA, and we're speaking to them at the moment in anticipation of these workshops and the new guidelines. But in the main, pretty much no Indigenous community-led projects are self-identified as rewilding. So if rewilding wants to remain relevant in these contexts, in the context of Indigenous lands, it has to change, it has to shift. My co-authors and I suggest 3 shifts. Not saying that this will solve the problems, but just suggestions. The first one is to be careful about lumping all humans into one category of ecological harm. Just like some individuals are working to heal our ecosystems, some cultures include commitments and capacity to heal and maintain ecosystems. So we think that paying closer attention to those cultures, collaborating with those people, placing them in leadership positions could make a big difference. Secondly, we think we should move beyond the language of wilderness, but let's not forget our respect for and our love of wildness. That wildness is the creative agency in nature, that capacity for other than human beings to grow and to heal and maintain ecosystems. And that capacity is something that rewilding already recognises, so it's already on the front foot. And it's a capacity that many Indigenous cultures have recognised for millennia, so perhaps it's a bridge. The third idea or suggestion is that rewilding doesn't have to mean hands-off conservation. We could frame it as a collaboration between humans and non-humans. That might also resonate with some Indigenous ideas of relational care, where humans are deeply embedded in reciprocal relationships with their ecological communities. That's a far better way to treat the animals we're rewilding with, rather than making them into green infrastructure or ecological labour, to quote Jamie Lorimer. I'd like to point to a couple of case studies. I'll just touch on them briefly. I'm sure the interested people here can go and find out a bit more about them. The first one I find really inspiring is a recent one. The Yurok tribe of the Pacific Northwest of the USA have just released 8 prey-no-geesh, or California condors, on their ancestral territory. It's quite symbolic. The prey-no-geesh are foundational to the Yurok obligations to bring balance to their landscapes. The birds' feathers are vital for their world renewal ceremonies. So you've got a project that links ecological restoration with cultural resurgence. Here in Australia, the Wairu Recovery Team is a collaboration between traditional owners and scientists in Central Australia. And that team has reintroduced 80 Wairu, or black-footed wallabies, back onto traditional lands. The project's been guided pretty clearly by traditional law, so that it's not just restoring a threatened species, but it's also strengthening connections to country and to chukapa, or dreaming. Back to North America, big project, the Buffalo Treaty. Buffalo herds were pretty much wiped out in the 19th century. They were critical to the cultures and the economies and the ecosystems of many First Nations people in what are now Canada and the USA. That cultural and economic shock is still felt by some of those tribes today, and it's still felt by their lands. About 10 years ago, dozens of First Nations groups signed this Buffalo Treaty, which brings them together to support one another to reintroduce buffalo to their ancestral lands. Now, buffalo are ecological engineers. They promote biodiversity, they control fire, they create habitats. They also support food sovereignty and spiritual healing and cultural continuity. And in the treaty, I think this is wonderful, they're described as a practitioner of conservation, a wild, free-ranging animal, and a brother who can lead people in nurturing their lands, plants, and other animals. So here's my last example, and it's something I'm involved in intimately. Here in Routledge, Tasmania, the Tasmanian Aboriginal community is restoring Lungtalanana, Clark Island. It's an 8,000 hectare island in the Bass Strait, and farming on the island, part of the process of colonisation, just smashed its ecosystems. It was burned from end to end. Most of the mammal community is gone. There are now feral cats on the island. And the project which I work on, which is funded by WWF Australia's Rewilding Australia program, involves repatriating culturally significant species like wombats and potoroos and wallabies, alongside cultural burning and feral cat eradication. Now, that community is refusing to call it rewilding, and because for them, it's a cultural restoration. So I hope you can see some of the connections here between rewilding and Indigenous community-led land care. But I also hope you can see that rewilding needs to do a bit of heavy lifting if it's going to become relevant to those Indigenous communities and to become acceptable on their lands. I think we really need to invite more Indigenous communities into these kinds of discussion, and we need to invite them to the upcoming workshops on rewilding. And with the RTG, I'm working on that. I really hope we can have some success. And the folks at the Flower Hill Institute even mentioned that they might run a parallel event, workshops, so that they can come up with their own definition of rewilding, which I think is fantastic. I think that rewilding needs, nonetheless, to rethink some of its basic principles, abandoning wilderness, perhaps embracing the idea of creative agency in nature, framing rewilding as collaboration outside the human community. And I think that might go some way towards supporting Indigenous communities and maybe receiving some of their support in return. Thank you. I'll drop some links into the chat in case people want to follow up on a couple of these programs. Let me do that now.
Thank you so much, Tristan and Robyn. Those were both fascinating discussions, point information. We're going to turn to some Q&A now. So if anybody has any questions, I haven't seen any in the chat so far. Just feel free to unmute yourself or put your hand up. And Jessica.
I just had a quick one, so I'm going to jump in straight away. And I think those three talks have been really interesting. The depth is really worth reviewing post-call. I'd love to see the presentations, but luckily they'll be online. And I wonder, in terms of, I totally agree with what you're saying, Tristan, and I totally understand where you're coming from. I wonder instead whether it's a case of a lack of communication about meaning with regard to what we're saying rewilding is in a broader way. For example, a lot of this is about minimizing drivers that degrade and disrupt ecosystems. And that, of course, is different depending on which cultural way you're existing and living. And I think that's just not something that's been promoted from a kind of communication point of view. But I think the essence of it are in the guidelines. It's just that they haven't been promoted and utilized in a way which is applicable and relevant to different groups, but it's all in there in its very kind of draft format, I would say. But that might just be my perspective, you know. I think it's how we interact with the environment that's a key problem. It's not that we're excluding anyone from it. So I'd be really interested to kind of explore that further.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, obviously, the way that you frame it in those guidelines is really important, and yeah, and the way that you talk about the drivers of impacts on ecosystems is really important. But in my experience with small amount of experience with Indigenous people, but sort of broad reading, I think that there is quite a cultural disconnect between the way that conservation scientists will talk about ecological impacts and the way that many Aboriginal people see their country and healing country. And, you know, do you want to reach across the divide or not? I think everybody does. So I guess it's kind of up to us, you know, as now I'm speaking as a scientist, it's kind of our job to reach across and make what we're doing relevant. So I'm just trying to find ways that we can make rewilding relevant, because I'm really inspired by it. I think it's fantastic. I think, you know, there's creative agency in nature and recognizing non-human others, but I also see that in what Indigenous people are doing as well. And sure, these things are worlds apart, but at the same time, I see that there's good hope for reaching across that divide and finding ways to collaborate better.
Thanks, Tristan. I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's about how it's communicated to different audiences, like anything, you know. Communication needs to consider who it's talking to and adapt its subtlety, but it doesn't mean that the intention and the guts are not there ready to be adapted, I think. But that's going to be a really important job for us to communicate properly.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think it's important also to note that rewilding is a changing concept, and it's, you know, from the 1980s and how it was first interpreted by those people pioneering rewilding. It has changed a lot, and those people have changed as well from, you know, being influenced. And, you know, my survey that we ran asked people what they thought rewilding was in the past and now in the future, and there's definitely been a shift and influence from Indigenous scholars, excuse me, like Robyn Bartel and Terry Tempest Williams in the States. And the other thing to say is that unfortunately there is a tendency to create conflict, I think, that's notable in the rewilding literature, because there's this tendency to overcorrect sometimes. I think when people who are more concerned about human issues see rewilding as being too ecological, they're overcorrect and vice versa. And I think it's created some tensions that really shouldn't be there, because ultimately we're all trying to achieve the same thing, which is the shared landscape and the shared vision. And so I think trying to create that vision that everybody can relate to would be really critical for rewilding guidelines. Robyn, did you want to add anything? I went to Ian, sorry.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sally and Tristan and Robyn. Really thoughtful presentations. And I think as you were speaking, Tristan, I was thinking about kind of IUCN's 20-year vision, and I'd kind of dropped some of that in the chat there. And I think it reflects an awful lot. This is the draft vision that was presented at the Regional Conservation Forum a few months ago, and I think it reflects an awful lot of what you were saying. The challenge for me is actually what does that look like in practice? How do we make that happen? And I think it has to go beyond just engagement and talking. It's got to be about co-development and co-production, and that's complex and messy, and it takes a lot of time. But we absolutely have to do that, I think. So really, I think it's really exciting, some of the things you were talking about and some of the projects that you were mentioning, but it yeah, we have to do that. We have to go beyond the kind of the normal practice, I suppose, of just consultation and engagement, which is often just a kind of one-way street. But yeah, it isn't going to be easy, but I think we have to do it. And you know, I absolutely want to do it in terms of how we take this group forward within the IUCN, and yeah, that's a bit waffly, but I'm absolutely with you. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
It's one interesting aspect of this, and look, I'm philosophers, I'm always banging on about concepts, but in practice you have to put Indigenous people in leadership positions so that they're making informed decisions about their land. Like, that's really at the core of what we're talking about here. And that's hard for conservationists because they're experts, especially conservation scientists, and they really do know what's good in terms of conservation for ecosystems. And so for them to step back and put the decisions in the hands of people who've come up with a very different kind of education can sometimes be very difficult. So that's something that I think we need to take into account. And I think it's probably reflected in the policy space as well. Like, if you're developing policy, you kind of need to put Indigenous people in leadership positions there too. On the other hand, like, all of the kinds of people who have the capacity for doing that kind of work are absolutely smashed right now with, they're all overworked, everybody wants a piece of them, like, so it is difficult, I understand. It's, you know, to find Indigenous people who want to engage in this process is also going to be a big challenge.
But at the same time, I think we absolutely have to do it. And I know the DG of IUCN, Gretel Aguilar, is passionate about this. And this was a kind of centerpiece, I think, of her presentation of the 20-year vision. So there's a real commitment, I think, from the IUCN to do this. But it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy.
No, and look, one of the implications is around timeframes. And, you know, if you're working to a particular time frame and you haven't found you know, an Indigenous group or experts who are willing to engage by that time, what do you do? Like, do you push your time frame out, or do you just go ahead without them? That's a tough decision that you have to kind of think about.
Great, and we have a question from Katerina in the chat. Katerina, do you want to jump on and give us your question in person?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for these three presentations. And while you were talking and putting out all these limitations on how we are currently approaching rewilding, I went back to this concept of two-eyed seeing approach, which means that one eye looks at the Indigenous culture and knowledge and practices, while the other eye is basically Western science. And my question is, if you, in your opinion, if you also see these types of limitations that you refer here in that approach, because it's being more and more adopted in many rewilding and conservation projects. And do you think it's suffering from the same limitations that you presented here, or if it's a true partnership between Western science and Indigenous knowledge and practices and can carry a more successful goals?
I guess I'll kick off just by saying, I think there are some good examples that we can learn from. I know, for example, of the Yellowstone to Yukon project, who really adapted their approach. I mean, they also started quite a long time ago, and have really reshaped their whole vision around trying to give agency to First Nations people in decision making and management positions. So kind of handing over some of the control they had of the project. And I think we can learn from those examples. And I don't think it's ever, you know, it's not perfect. And I don't think they'll ever say that it's been a perfect process. But yeah, they've really refocused to trying to work with Indigenous people in the region. I don't know if Tristan or Robyn have anything to add.
You go, Robyn. I already gave my Lungtalamana project a big plug.
Yeah, thank you. I suppose it's, I think that some of the, thinking about ways forward seem to be a little bit willfully agnostic about history. I think the history actually is vitally important. There's no kind of all of a sudden, we've started from, this point and everyone's on a level playing field. That's not how it is. And it's not just that there's legacy issues, there are current issues. And this is not a question of, conversational nicety or considerations of, definitions. This is about actual real world violence and a legacy of colonisation in the situations that we've been discussing today. Having said that, I'm a geographer, so nothing is one size fits all. So the context that we've been speaking to are very specific from our experiences, and noting that for many of us, we're taking responsibility for these actions. We're not suggesting that this is something that we're sort of thinking that we are in control over. It's something that we're thinking that we need to take responsibility for and reckon with. This is our job. It's not something that we need to ask yet another role or responsibility to be performed by our Indigenous colleagues. So I think that that's not necessarily, however, the situation everywhere. It is the situation from the context in which we have experience. And I think that's where the provocation comes from, that this kind of universalizing of ideals is not actually place-based. And I think therefore it's also got that disconnection embedded into it.
Great. We have, I think, time for one more quick question, and I see there's one from Spencer. Can you comment at all on land ownership transfers to Indigenous governments within the realm of conservation? Will the IUCN guidance you are drafting have any such case studies? I don't know if our panel have any comments, but I might actually call on Katerina or Edwina. I know you're both lawyers and working in this area. Or if anybody else has any comments on that as well. Robyn, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I might jump in there actually. Whose notion of land ownership? Which institution of property? Under which constitution are we operating? I think a lot of these are also, again, sort of concessions by a sort of dominant system. So unless we're actually talking about recognising a different legal system, I think it's still going to be a kind of concessional approach. So that would be my just my comment on that one. Thank you.
If I may, I just want to add to what Robyn just said, because I would ask the same. And this is how the fields are not leveled, especially seen at land ownership transfers. Like the case that I know better is the US, and all the readings and all the webinars I attend on this matter, you can see those unbalances that Robyn just talked about. So what kind of these land transfers are done within the legal system dominant in the US, and not as so it's treated as a concession, kind of a historic compensation, but that brings a lot of issues. So So yeah, that's I would say, at least in the US, it's being very problematic how these land transfers are being done, and not and they do not go to the point where Indigenous communities kind of recover their rightful land. So it's an angle. It's an angle issue from what kind of legal system are you talking about, because they are different. Yeah, I would agree with Robyn on that.
Okay, just wanted to say thanks for your answer. Could talk about that all day, but I'll just say thank you. Yeah, great answer.
Thank you so much, everyone. We're kind of coming to an end of time now. So I just want to again thank the panel, Robyn and Tristan, and the people who have helped to organize, Emma, Jessica. Thanks also for joining us, and please do feel free to follow up with questions to any of us. So thanks very much.
Can I, just before we go, Sally, can I just
sorry.
say thanks everyone for coming along. If you want to, or if you're interested in joining the Rewilding Thematic Group, we'd really welcome you. So, and I think in terms of the guidelines that we're developing, we're very much aware that this is, guidelines are an iterative process. They're never finished, you know, so they should be living, breathing documents, and we're absolutely aware that we have a lot of work to do in terms of developing meaningful partnerships with Indigenous groups. So thank you very much for your presentations this morning. They were really useful.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Cheers.